And tonight we're going to consider how it is that a university like Duke and peer institutions do or do not cultivate the virtues in contemporary life and help students along their way toward a life that they could look at and say that's a worthy life, a life to esteem. So we're looking forward to that conversation. And I now have the pleasure of inviting our provost, Sally Kornbluth, up to introduce our speaker.
I appreciate the invitation to do the introduction. Before introducing our speaker, though, I'd like to have a big special welcome to our guests from Chapel Hill, Mrs. Guskowitz, Laredo Mansfeld, and Clemens. So we're delighted that you all could join us. So our speaker tonight, William Deresiewicz, taught English at Columbia and Yale for several years before becoming a full-time writer and public intellectual in 2008. In 2011, Dr. Deresiewicz published A Jane Austen Education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter. And I'm told that he guest taught a Jane Austen seminar today. In 2014, Dr. Deresiewicz wrote the provocative and best-selling book, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way of Meaningful Life. And as I was just saying before, I remember when my kids were actually undergraduates walking in and they were reading this book and kind of, So there were definitely some controversial, provocative things for students who are currently in college. And in addition to these books, Dr. Deresiewicz has published more than 250 essays and reviews in outlets including the New York Times, the Atlantic, Harper's, The Nation, and the New Republic. He's won a number of awards for his writing, including a Sydney Award for his piece, Solitude and Leadership. As you might expect, along the way, our guest speaker has spoken at many colleges and universities, although, as I understand, never before at Duke, before tonight. So the title of his talk is Change Your Mind First, College and the Urge to Save the World. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thanks for making time. So this talk is not going to be from Excellent Sheep, which I understand a lot of you have read some of or part of. I hear it's quite good. The rest of you should read it. This is sort of like the new album. This is kind of stuff that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years. And as you're about to hear, I think especially relevant. I mean, I think it reflects not only the continuation of my own line of thinking since 2014, but I also think new developments in the world since 2014 and things that I said about young people then that I think are absolutely not true anymore. So let me just launch in here. A new spirit, it's clear, is abroad among America's youth, beginning with the Occupy movement in 2011, gathering additional force with the emergence of Black Lives Matter in 2014, and redoubling itself yet again after the election of Donald Trump. A zeal for activism and social justice unseen since the early 1970s has taken hold on campus and beyond. Ask a college student what they hope to do with their lives, and the answer is apt to be some version of have an impact, change things for the better, or make the world a better place. Your generation, to the extent that we can speak about your generation, to the extent to which you're entitled to take credit for your generation is absolutely to be commended for this. It certainly marks a radical improvement over my own. I graduated high school in '81. Ronald Reagan was elected president my senior year of high school. Of my 6 best friends, 3 were proud conservatives, members of, as people called them then, the Reagan Youth. My years in college saw the beginning of the rush on elite private campuses to Wall Street and consulting. One little factoid, in 1983, 40% of Princeton seniors applied for jobs at one bank, First Boston, alone, in addition to all the others who applied for jobs at all the other banks. Greed was good, as the movie famously said. Idealism was for suckers, and the 60s were dead and buried. And let me be clear, it's not even so much that half of my friends were conservatives or that this was the age of Reagan youth. It wasn't that they were conservatives per se, although that's noteworthy. It's that it was the beginning of a great it didn't, what being a Reagan youth, let's say, or really just being a youth in the 80s meant in general, was not being conservative, it was really being depoliticized. This was the beginning of a great depoliticization, a great stepping away from politics, a great rejection of politics among American youth that lasted really for 30 years. So good for you guys, and more power to you. But there is one important thing that seems to be, to me, to be conspicuously missing from today's impulse to socially meaningful action. One important thing that's missing. And to explain what it means and why it matters, I want to start by quoting a passage from an educator named David Neidorff, who's the president of Deep Springs College. Maybe some of you have heard of Deep Springs College. It's got 25 students in the middle of the desert. It's a very unusual place. It's an exchange. It's from an essay he wrote where he reports an exchange he had with an 8-year-old boy. And presumably, he doesn't say this, but presumably they were talking about philosophy, and the boy asks him what philosophy means and explained to him what philosophy is. So Neidorff says, now, here's a philosophy question for you. What makes a person good? And the boy says, oh, that's an easy one. A good person is somebody who helps other people. And Neidorff says, really? So what does a good person help other people to do? And the boy says, whatever they're trying to do. And Neidorff says, well, do they help people do anything they want to do, no matter what? And the boy says, well, no, I guess not. So Neidorff says, okay, so out of all the things that people try to do, which one does a good person help them to do? And the boy says, oh, that's easy. He helps them do things that are good. Now, presumably those of you who just chuckled, like the child, according to Neidorff, noticed right away the circularity of their exchange, which Neidorff adds in his essay, reproduces the opening argument of Plato's Republic. Good people are people who help other people do good. So the good has been defined in terms of itself. That's why it's a circular argument, which means that it hasn't been defined at all. Good people do good things. That's not an explanation, it's not a definition. Now the relevance of this dialogue to your generational project, and probably to your personal project, becomes apparent as soon as we reflect that the concept of the good is embedded in the word that lies at the heart of your collective and individual self-definition, better, right? To change things for the better, to make the world a better place. Better means more good. So the question arises, what is good? And the answer, as our 8-year-old boy discovered, is not as easy as it seems. The problem of the good is one of those questions that's likely to make you realize when you start to think about it that you've never really thought about it at all, that you've simply taken the answer for granted. It might even make you realize that you don't even know how to think about it. One of the problems with the concept of the good, one of the challenges it forces on us, as Neidorff notes, is that it points to what he calls real and competing ends, which makes me think of the famous argument from the philosopher and intellectual historian Isaiah Berlin, who said that the characteristic ideals of liberal society, equality, freedom, justice, are to some degree irreconcilably in conflict. Freedom often leads to inequality. Equality often demands the diminishment of freedom. As it happens, this conflict is vividly apparent in perhaps the most important debate taking place on campuses today, the struggle over restrictions on offensive speech. On one side, freedom of expression. On the other, the need to create an environment in which all feel able to participate as equals. And the same kinds of dilemmas arise not just on campus, but in society as a whole. The same kinds of difficult, ongoing, sometimes irreducible conflicts. Berlin says this is why politics is inherently tragic, because you can't have everything all at once. You have to make choices between irreducibly competing ends. And even to say that is already to assume that we have satisfying definitions for each of those ends in particular, that we know what we mean when we speak about freedom or equality or justice. Justice, after all, is the topic of Plato's Republic, a book that runs to about 400 pages in English translation, and most people think they still don't really get to a good definition by the end of it. Or of beauty, or truth, or happiness, or prosperity, or success. It's easy to know what you're against, a lot harder to come up with any kind of specific idea about what you want to put it in place, with, that is, a coherent vision of the social good, rather than a bundle of slogans, like overthrowing the patriarchy, or dismantling hierarchies of power. Or maybe it's not even that easy to know what you're against. I often hear people declare their opposition to capitalism, but the way they use the term suggests that they don't really know what capitalism is. They appear to equate it with greed, or inequality, or markets, or money, or having to work, all of which predate the emergence of capitalism by thousands of years and have been features of most, if not all, human society since the agricultural revolution. Nor do I hear any clear ideas, or for that matter, any ideas at all, about what we should put in place of capitalism. If you don't want capitalism, which let's define it briefly as the private ownership of production, the free market distribution of goods, and the cycle of investment and profit, if that's what capitalism is and you don't like it, so what do you want? State control of the economy, or centralized planning, or small-scale collectivism? Those are not rhetorical questions. I'm not saying any of those things are bad. These are real questions. The kinds of questions that need to be addressed if you really want to bring about the end of capitalism. What comes afterwards? And that's just an example. The larger point is that when you commit yourself to the good, to making the world a better place, you need to commit yourself, first of all, not to action at all, but to something else, something that must precede action, something called reflection, or contemplation, or analysis, or study. In a word, you must commit yourself to thought. Yet that is precisely what I find to be lacking today in progressive circles, no less than anywhere else, not just on campuses, but everywhere. Nobody wants to think. Certainly, nobody wants to think about their own beliefs, values, and assumptions. Now, this is always a problem everywhere. Nobody ever wants to think about their beliefs, values, and assumptions. It's too much trouble, and it's much too troubling. Asking people to think about their beliefs, values, and assumptions is what Plato's teacher Socrates went around Athens doing until his fellow citizens decided they were sick of hearing him, and they said, "Here, drink this hemlock." But I also believe that the problem is especially acute today, particularly for young people, more particularly for progressive college students, most particularly for progressive students at elite private colleges. In other words, people exactly like you. That's because we live at a time, some of you know this already because you read something I wrote about this. We live at a time when progressive opinion is hardened into something approaching religious dogma. There's a right way to think, and a right way to talk, and a right set of things to think and talk about. Secularism is taken for granted. Environmentalism is a sacred cause. Issues of identity, particularly the holy trinity of race, gender, and sexuality, occupy the center of the discourse. The assumption on the left is that we are already in full possession of the moral truth. The fact that this may also be the assumption on the right is neither here nor there. The point is what's happening on the left, on my side, and probably on the side that most of you identify with. We supposedly already know what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. There's really nothing to discuss. We just need to talk about the best way to put our beliefs into practice. That's what I mean when I say that progressive opinion is hardened into something approaching religious dogma. Now, dogma makes for ideological consensus, and consensus is enforced by social means, most obviously today through social media. I'm sure I don't need to explain that to you. You understand social media and what it's like to live on social media better than I do. But the tighter the social environment is, the stronger and more stultifying its consensus is likely to be. High schools tend to be such environments, but unless you're at a boarding school, when you're in high school, you get to go home at the end of the day. Colleges are even worse in that respect. They are the kind of institutions that sociologists call total institutions, places that subsume the totality of their members' lives, like prisons, monasteries, mental hospitals, or the military, for interesting analogies to the college experience. The social cost of dissent is correspondingly higher. The progressive ideological consensus is correspondingly tighter. And I'm sure I don't need to explain that to you either. In fact, we had a conversation about this in the class this morning. Certainly not, given everything I'd already heard even before I got here on elite private college campuses, and I spent time at a lot of them. Students seldom disagree with one another anymore in class. So I've been told about school after school. And the reason, said one of the students I talked to at a liberal arts college in the Northwest, is mainly that they really don't have any disagreements. Another added that when they take up an issue in class, it's not, let's talk about issue X, but let's talk about why such and such a position is the correct one to have on issue X. A third student at a selective women's college in Southern California told me that the first thing she learned to do when she got to college was to keep quiet about her Christian faith and her non-feminist views about marriage, which were informed by her Christian faith. A fourth informed me that he's careful when questioning consensus beliefs to phrase his opinion in terms of, explain to me why I'm wrong. Still others have told me that any challenge to the reigning dogma will get you branded as a racist, as in, don't talk to that guy, he's a racist. As for why these things are worse at elite private colleges, even than they are at other schools, that's because such colleges are so homogenous in social terms. Their student populations largely come from the liberal upper and upper middle classes, multiracial but predominantly white or white and Asian, with an admixture of lower income students of color. People sometimes call this the barbell demographics. Lots of rich white and Asian kids at one end, and a smaller number of students of color, lower income students of color at the other end, with nothing in between. No other areas of American society represented. And those two demographics, at the ends of the barbell, have broadly similar political beliefs, as evidenced by the fact that they together constitute a large percentage of the Democratic Party base, especially the more progressive end of the Democratic Party. The communities of origin of students at elite private colleges, principally affluent suburbs and upscale urban enclaves, already tend to share the liberal consensus, and so do the private or well-resourced, might as well be private, public high schools from which those students tend to come. As you may know, or you should know if you don't, Duke, in particular, I looked up the numbers. You know, you're one of the roughly 36 colleges that have more people from the 1% than from the bottom 60%. You have 19% of students at Duke, that's almost 1 in 5, come from the top 1%, and only 16.5 come from the bottom 60%, which means that if you do the math, your chances of getting into Duke, if you grew up in the 1%, are 76 times better than if you go to the bottom, if you're from the bottom 60. By the way, the number that comes from the bottom 20, they're like truly poor, let's say, is 4%. 4%. So your chance of getting in if you come from the 1% are 95 times better than if you come from the bottom 20%. Now, all this is one thing that actually was better in the 1980s. There weren't a lot of things that were better. This was one of them. Communities weren't, it's really a horrible time. You're glad you missed it. You should be glad you missed it. Communities were not as ideologically homogenous then, and neither were young people, not even young people who went to fancy private colleges. As I said, almost half of my friends' group in high school were conservatives. They were all rich, but they were conservatives. There was no consensus, no groupthink, no getting away from radically different positions, no avoiding having to mount a cogent response. You couldn't not talk to that guy. Even within the left, at a time when Marxist ideas and ideologies were still important elements of the intellectual climate, a wide range of disagreement prevailed, as I saw when I got to college. Trotskyites argued with social democrats, trade union liberals with anarcho-syndicalists, reformists with revolutionaries. There were Maoists running around and Spartacists and all kinds of exotic animals in the Marxist menagerie, and they were all throwing rhetorical bombs at each other. Because we had to defend our positions against vigorous and regular assaults, which couldn't simply be stigmatized or dismissed, we were forced to think them through. Now, none of this is to idealize or even to praise the students of my generation. We really were a bunch of little stinkers, and the Marxists in particular were totally obnoxious. And the truth is, we arrived in college just as certain of ourselves as you guys did, or as any bunch of 18-year-olds ever does. But there was another difference. There was a difference in the prevailing idea about what college was for. Today, the idea is that the purpose of college is to equip you with the tools to go out and pursue your goals. If that seems self-evident to you, like what the hell else would college be for, than to give you the tools to go out and pursue your goals, it's a good thing that you're listening to me today, I think. Now, mainly this has nothing to do with ideology one way or the other. Mainly, the prevailing idea of college is that its exclusive purpose is to equip you for success in the labor market. If this were a different kind of talk, one that was maybe more drawn from my book, I would explain why that represents such a desperately impoverished idea of what, not only of education, but of life. Although that's also going to be implicit in some of what I'm about to say. But let's leave that aside, the vocational idea of college and everything that that implies. Even when the idea of college is understood in higher terms than just success in the job market, when it's couched in words like leadership, my least favorite word in the world, or service, which is my second or third least favorite word in the world, or phrases like giving back, or making a contribution, or indeed like building a better world, the same approach applies. College is the place where you acquire the tools to pursue your goals, where you study environmental engineering, or global public health, or gender theory, where you develop practical skills like communications or problem solving, but not where you question those goals, the ends to which those tools and skills are to be put. Not where you take the risk of coming out a radically different person from the one who went in, with very different beliefs, values, and assumptions. The kind of person at 22 who might look at you at 18 and think, what was wrong with that person? Or the kind of person at 18 who might look at your future 22 and think, that person's a pig. I would never want to be that person. But then you've turned into that person. Because that's my conception of college, an older conception of college. College is the place that teaches you precisely how to think, that teaches you to think, that forces you to approach and shows you how to approach those fundamental questions that I started by talking about. What is the good? What are freedom, equality, and justice, beauty, truth, happiness, success? What do I care about, and what do I want? You might also say that it's a place where you learn how to be wrong, and when to be wrong and why to be wrong. So I think your fundamental job as students is not to make the world a better place, but to take those questions on. I'm not saying that your job in life isn't to make the world a better place. I'm saying that your job as students is something else. Before you can learn, you have to unlearn. You don't arrive in college a blank slate. You arrive having already been inscribed with all the ways of thinking and feeling that the world has been instilling in you from the moment you were born. The myths, the narratives, the pieties, the sacred words. As Alan Bloom wrote, your soul is a mirror of what is around you. I always noticed as a teacher of freshmen that my students could be counted on to produce an opinion about any given subject the moment I brought it up. And I thought, my God, they've thought about all these things before. That's quite remarkable. And then I realized, no, they hadn't actually thought about these things. It's just that their minds were like a chemical bath of conventional attitudes that would instantly precipitate out of solution and coat whatever object you introduced in kind of a hard, impenetrable shell. And just so you know that I'm an equal opportunity offender, this is hardly confined to 18-year-olds. We might say, in perhaps too lofty a way, that society is a conspiracy to keep itself from the truth. We pass our lives submerged in propaganda, advertising messages, political rhetoric, the journalistic affirmation of the status quo, the platitudes of popular culture, the axioms of party, sect, and class, the bromides we exchange every day on Facebook, the comforting lies that our parents tell us, and the sociable lies our friends do, the steady stream of falsehoods that we each tell ourselves all the time to stave off the threat of self-knowledge. Plato called this doxa, opinion, like orthodox or heterodox. And it is as powerful a force among progressives as among conservatives. In New England, as in the South, for atheists as for fundamentalists. So the central purpose of a real education, or as people call it, a liberal arts education, can be understood as liberating us from doxa by teaching us to recognize it, to question it, and to think our way around it. One of my favorite writers on higher ed is an English professor at UVA named Mark Edmondson, who has a wonderful book called Teacher. It's actually not about college at all. It's about his teacher he had when he was a senior in high school and how he played this role for him. His teacher's methods were the same as those of Socrates himself. He echoed his students' opinions back to them or forced them to articulate them for themselves. And by dragging those opinions into the light, by asking you to defend them or just acknowledge having them, which is a big thing to begin with, he began to break them down, to expose them to the operations of the critical intelligence, and thus to develop that intelligence in the first place. The point was not to replace his students' opinions with his own. If you have a teacher who's trying to do that, you should walk out. You should leave. The point was to bring his charges into the unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and endlessly fertile condition of doubt. He was teaching them not what to think, but how. And that is a professor's most important role, to make you think with rigor, precisely, patiently, responsibly, remorselessly, and not only about your deepest ingrained presuppositions, as my own professor Karl Kroeber once wrote, but also about, quote, your most exhilarating new insights, most of which turn out to be fallacious. You want some people in your life whose job it is to tell you that you're wrong. As I said, to teach you how to be wrong, to teach you when and why to change your mind. Now, I used that phrase liberal arts a minute ago, and I want to expand on it for a few minutes because the term is employed a lot, and it's employed much more often than it's actually understood. I even had a person who had recently become a president of a liberal arts college tell me that no one was able to define the liberal arts for him. And then I offered him the definition that I'm about to offer you, and he said, no, that can't be right. So I said, well, maybe people have been able to define it for you, but you just haven't been able to listen. I think he just didn't want to believe that his college was really about this. I said, well, what is your college about? He said, it's about leadership. Which was really about Wall Street. That's really what that meant. But let's leave that aside. Different school. The liberal arts have nothing to do. This is an unfortunate, I think especially today, unfortunate coincidence. They have nothing to do with liberalism in the political sense. It's unfortunate because it means that conservative politicians attack the liberal arts because they think it has to do with liberalism. And they also have nothing to do with the arts in the sense of the fine arts like music or painting. They're also not defined as all the things your parents wish you wouldn't study. They include the humanities, English, philosophy, history, religious studies, but they're not confined to the humanities. That's a common misconception. The liberal arts are those disciplines in which the pursuit of knowledge is conducted for its own sake, which is why they include the sciences and social sciences as well. Physics, biology, chemistry are liberal arts just as much as English and philosophy are. So are anthropology, poli-sci, and economics. I mean, just the fact that just because a lot of people study economics to get rich doesn't mean that they're not a liberal art. They stand in contrast to vocational or applied fields. That's the difference. So in the liberal arts, you pursue the trail of inquiry wherever it leads. And the purpose is truth, not utility or reward. So that's why you don't just learn a certain body of material when you study the liberal arts. Fundamentally, you learn how knowledge is created. And if it's a good course, you do the knowledge acquisition yourself. I mean, you sort of read the textbook yourself. You acquire the information yourself. Because the point is not to acquire information. It's to acquire it so that you can then debate it, right? How do we know it's true? What further questions does it raise? What are the premises that underlie the discipline in question as a whole? What are the methods by which it proceeds? You learn, in other words, that there is, strictly speaking, no such thing as information. There are only arguments. Every fact has been created by an argument and is susceptible to being overturned by the next argument that comes along. We might even say that a fact is nothing more than a frozen argument, a place where a certain line of inquiry has come temporarily to rest. And we can consider in this context that the term that science applies to its highest form of truth, the things that it knows with the greatest degree of certainty, is. That's the wrong answer. Although law, it's true, they say law. But isn't it the real term is theory, right? I mean, even laws are theories. The most certain it gets in the sciences, correct me if I'm wrong, is a theory. In fact, it takes a lot just for a hypothesis to become a theory. And nothing is ever known with complete, I mean, there's certain things, the law of gravity, that we don't think will ever be overturned. So we're willing to call them a law. But they could be, right? Nothing is ultimately finally settled. So when you study the liberal arts, you do the hard, slow, painstaking work, or should, of learning to analyze the arguments of others and to make your own in turn. To marshal evidence, evaluate existing authorities, anticipate objections, synthesize your findings within a logically coherent structure, and communicate the results with clarity and force. There's an anecdote that the historian Simon Schama tells about a student who approached him after lecture to say that his father hadn't sent him to Harvard to become more confused. He was very upset about what was happening in Schama's lectures. And Schama said, yes, he did, or at least he should have. Probably he didn't send his kid to go to Harvard to become more confused. He sent them to reproduce their family wealth. But Schama's agenda, anyway, was different. College is the place to learn that most of what we believe, history is indeed exemplary in this regard, which is one of the reasons that the teaching of history is such a hot political topic, is much more provisional and complicated than we care to admit. Now, this may have already sounded to you like mental masturbation, the pointless multiplication of complexity and nuance, the endless entertainment of theories, hypotheses, and alternatives, everything that people mean when they use the word academic in a pejorative sense. But what it actually is an honest confrontation with reality. And we don't get a lot of honest confrontations with reality. The world is full of immensely intricate things, like the structure of an enzyme, or the language of a Shakespeare play, or the workings of a modern economy. Despite our desire for clear and simple answers, the truth is very hard to come by. We proceed by doubt, by trial and error, by resisting the impulse to lunge after certainty. Now, if that sounds really hard, it's because it is really hard, and it's supposed to be really hard. And if you're taking a class, for example, that isn't hard, you're cheating yourself. It would be like if the football coach only made you practice twice a week. It would be a lot easier, but you would be very good, and you'd lose all your games. In fact, what happens in a good course is directly connected to learning how to make arguments. Like, that's what writing papers are for. You write a paper that makes an argument, and then your teacher goes through it point by point, identifying errors in logic, faults in structure, problems with the way you handled evidence, opportunities you missed, places where objections should have been anticipated. She also raises further questions, suggests additional lines of inquiry, and commends the ways in which you did things right. By the way, that teaching thing is very, very labor intensive. I'm not going to address myself to the deans in the audience, but this is why the whole set of priorities with which we hire, promote, and reward faculty is so deeply screwed up. Because in research universities, teaching is actively disincentivized, whereas good teaching, even if you're already a good teacher, is extremely labor intensive for the reasons I just said. We will leave that aside. Let's get back to the student experience of this. It sucks, right? It's supposed to feel really bad. I mean, I got my first college paper back, and there was a B, and the comment, "This argues well for your success in college." And I thought, you gave me a B. What the hell does that mean? But that was good in that context, because I didn't really know how to write. I didn't really know anything. So you're supposed to get a lot of comments back. You're supposed to go to office hours and talk about what you did wrong and how you can do better, and your teacher's supposed to be available for you to do that. And you don't just go through this once, right? You go through this again and again and again in class after class after class. You write a 3-page essay your first week of freshman year, and then maybe you write some 15-page seminars when you're a junior, and then hopefully you have some capstone paper, senior essay, 50, 80 pages. Or if you're a science major, you go through the analogous process with lab reports or computer programs or mathematical proofs. You're learning how to think. And even 4 years is barely enough to make a decent start, which is why typically if you're going to be a highly trained professional, you go into graduate school where you'll have specialized training in a particular field. If you consider in terms of the proverbial 10,000 hours that it takes to develop a skill, 10,000 hours in 4 years of going to college for 30 weeks a year would work out to about 12 hours a day. That's not the worst idea in the world, but it's probably unrealistic that you're going to actually study for 12 hours a day. What's definitely a bad idea is to study more like 12 hours a week. And I'm not actually picking that number arbitrarily. There was a good book that came out a few years ago with lots of social scientific data to backing it up called Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses. And what it found out is that most students don't learn very much in college. And that cuts across different prestige levels of institutions. They didn't name any of the schools, so I don't know where Duke ranked, but they found that on average students study about 12 hours a week. And also that it's about half as much as they did 50 years ago. And what they found was the thing that correlates with learning in college is how much you study. So, do with that what you will. That was part 2 of the talk. This is the last part 3. In describing everything I said in part 2, and I was talking about liberal arts and thinking and writing your papers, what a liberal arts education entails, I've actually blurred the very distinction that I insisted on before and that I want to come back to now. Insisted on in part 1. I've just been explaining how college helps you think with rigor and precision, but we need to recognize that there are, which people often don't do, and I still haven't finished really thinking through this myself, but there are 2 different kinds of rigorous thinking, that I'm sure of, that college should ask you to do. 2 different kinds, and they correspond to the 2 ways of conceiving of the purpose of college that I was talking about before. The first kind is that instrumental kind, where you acquire tools and skills that enable you to operate in the world, professional success, and on the world, to solve problems, to get things done, to become an expert, a specialist, a professional, a technocrat. A liberal arts education is very good at training you to do that, which is why studying the liberal arts is very useful in the job market, despite what everybody seems to believe. If this was a different talk, I would expand on that. I have a few pages on this in the book. I really hit you over the head with it in the book because I know nobody believes that. But especially if you go to a place like Duke, liberal arts degree, you're going to do great. But let's leave that aside. This kind of thinking, this instrumental kind, involves addressing specific technical questions in whatever discipline that have specific answers that can be worked out through predictable, iterable methods, equations, experiments, studies, statistical models. The knowledge so acquired is also sequential and cumulative. Freshman chemistry, organic chemistry, physical chemistry, and so on and so forth. You learn in a particular order and you learn more and more. And there's certainly nothing wrong with this kind of learning. I am not criticizing this. It enables you to achieve what the educational bureaucrats like to call mastery. Mastery of a subject. It's a very interestingly chosen word, probably not chosen for this reason. Mastery of a subject enables you to have mastery over the world. It gives you power. But this kind of learning does not work for that other kind of thinking, the kind that I was talking about at the beginning, where you wonder about the nature of good, for example. The kind that we use to address those fundamental, and in some sense, fundamentally irresolvable questions of value and purpose and meaning that should lie at the heart of a liberal arts education, because they lie at the heart of life itself. The questions raised by experience, the questions that need to be addressed in order to navigate experience, in order to go through the world, in order to conduct your life. Not to succeed professionally, but to conduct your life. Now here, and I think maybe some of the grown-ups in the room aren't going to like this, but I think we do need to make a distinction between the humanities and the other liberal arts, because I at least believe that it is the humanities and only the humanities that allow you to ask these questions. I was a science major. I love science majors. We didn't ask questions about the meaning of life in chemistry class. But the humanities, history, philosophy, religious studies, literature, and the other arts, are the record of the ways that people have come to terms with being human. That's one way to define the humanities. There's no great way to define them, but that's the way I think is most apt. The questions about what it means to be human. Questions that are proper to us, not as this or that kind of specialist or professional, but individuals as such. The very questions we're apt to ask when we look up from our work and think about our lives, assuming we do look up from our work and think about our lives. Questions of love, death, family, morality, time, truth, God, and everything else within the wide, starred universe of human experience. That kind of thinking is different. It can and must be rigorous and precise, but it can't be sequential or cumulative or iterable or predictable. It can't be captured or measured with the kinds of assessments you're used to being subject to in other educational contexts. Multiple choice questions, or skill-based exams, or memorization and regurgitation. There's no multiple choice exam I can think of that enables you to answer the meaning of life, although that would be an interesting experiment. It does not involve the same capacities and is not good for the same purposes as that other kind of thinking, which is why we often reach for other words to name it, like reflection or contemplation, which gesture towards the soul or spirit, not just the mind or intellect. I want to offer, I know that might sound kind of nebulous, and that's part of why it's hard to talk about this and hard to think about it. So I want to try to nail it down at least a little bit by offering a few points of orientation that have helped me to think about it from a few different writers. Again, two kinds of thinking, two kinds of different things that you can do with that thinking. The first comes from Eva Braun, who's a longtime teacher at the St. John's Great Books College. A long time, like she's in her 80s and she's been doing it for 60 years. And she wrote a book a few years ago, back when she was only in her 60s, called Paradoxes of Education in a Republic, about the difference between instrumental reason, which can be used as a tool to operate on the world, and what she calls the question-asking intellect, which functions, she says, by being receptive to the world, not by operating on the world. A genuine question, she writes, is an expectant vacancy, a receptive openness, a defined ignorance, and above all, a directed desire. My second point of reference comes from the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who has a book called Crises of the Republic, essays she wrote mainly in the 60s. One of them was on the Pentagon Papers. Really, it's on the people that the Pentagon Papers were about. In other words, the architects of the Vietnam War, the so-called whiz kids. They were all really smart. They went to places like Harvard. They entered government young. The gang of experts that David Halberstam would later call, in a rancidly sarcastic phrase that has since somehow lost its irony and become the standard compliment we pay our high-achieving students, the best and the brightest. That's where that phrase came from. It was very sarcastic. Arendt refers to these people as the problem solvers because they conducted the war by reducing it to a set of metrics, of inputs, algorithms, procedures, and finally of predictions, which, she says, unaccountably never came true. If you've seen any documentaries or read any books about the Vietnam War, Errol Morris's documentary about McNamara, who was the head of them, he was the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, or Ken Burns' Vietnam, you know exactly what she's talking about. Or I should say, if you've been to high school lately, because the problem solvers are in charge of education too. Inputs, algorithms, metrics, procedures, predictions, which never come true. The problem solvers, she writes, did not judge, they calculated. They trusted the calculating powers of their brains at the expense of the mind's capacity for experience and its ability to learn from it. Now, needless to say, Arendt's calculating power corresponds to Brand's instrumental reason, and what Arendt calls the ability to learn from experience depends on Brand's receptive openness and defined ignorance. And also, a defined ignorance is, first of all, an acknowledged ignorance. My third and last point of reference comes from a contemporary educator named Diana Seneschal, who has a recent book. She teaches philosophy at a public high school in New York. That fact alone I find remarkable. She teaches philosophy at a public high school in New York, and it's not even a magnet school, it's just a regular school. And she has a book called Republic of Noise, in which she discusses some of the fallacies that operate in mainstream education now, one of which is the idea that students need to achieve mastery over all the material that is put in front of them, that they need to learn it completely and demonstrate that competence through certain kinds of assessments, ideally quantifiable ones. And again, mastery is a perfectly acceptable standard if we're talking about calculus or Spanish or chemistry. But when you study Plato, Seneschal says, or I would say Shakespeare, or anything else in the humanities, there is no such thing as mastery. No one ever masters those works, which is precisely why they're worth coming back to again and again. And no one ever masters the questions that those works impose on us, which is why they too are worth coming back to, are necessary to come back to again and again. They are the questions, as the writer Jeff Dyer puts it, that stay put. The images of a giant boulder that's in your path, they stay put. The questions, I would add, that the world asks of you rather than the other way around. And the main question that the world asks of you is, who are you? Not what are you, to use a distinction from James Baldwin. Not what identity group do you belong to, but who are you as an individual? Baldwin says, the world had already told me what I was. I wanted to find out who I was. The only appropriate relationship in which to stand to those works and those questions is receptive openness, defined ignorance, and directed desire. You don't read King Lear so you can master King Lear. You read it for what it does to you, for the way it changes you. And you take that into the next thing you read and hopefully into the rest of your life. And it's an experience, right? Reading Lear is an experience. And it enhances your mind's capacity for experience and its ability to learn from it. So that's what studying the humanities should do for you. Although only if they're being taught the way they should, I think, which is often not the case, not if they're taught as another form of technocratic expertise, not as a form of ideological indoctrination, but as an open-ended exploration that instructors and students undertake together. When a professor trains you in that other kind of thinking, the instrumental kind, they have the answers. They better have the answers. That's why they got their PhDs. In the context of reflection, they don't. The big questions are persistent questions because no one has the answers. So I urge you as you go forward in college to seek out the kinds of teachers who understand this, the kind who want to humanize you, the kind who, no matter what specific subject they're teaching, give you the sense that you're learning about life itself or the world or everything, as people like to say about their favorite teachers. I felt like it was a class about everything. That's the kind of class you should have. So, and I'm getting towards the end here. If I had to pick a single word to sum up what reflection can help you achieve, what Arendt found so missing in the problem solvers, in the technocrats, it would be wisdom. It's no coincidence that the practice of philosophy, which was founded in the West by Socrates, means love of wisdom. And if I had to define wisdom, which is not an easy word to define, I would say that it is not knowledge per se, but a kind of deftness, a kind of tact or touch in the application of knowledge specifically such knowledge as derives from experience. A wise person is the kind of person you go to not for information, but for counsel. Not for good answers, but for better questions. Now, you might receive this notion that wisdom should be your goal with considerable dismay, because after all, the word is associated with age. It's something that most people don't achieve until later in life, if at all. So let's just say that as college is the start of what will surely be a long professional career, so should it be the start of a long road to becoming wise. Which is fine, because the truth is that for all your desire to change the world, it's likely going to be a long while before you have any real power to do so. You might as well acquire some wisdom to go along with that power by the time you achieve it. And let's be clear, power is what you're after. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to be honest about that. If we want to see what happens when power is exercised in the absence of wisdom, you can look at today's whiz kids, the ones who run Silicon Valley, and therefore determine so much of how the rest of us live. As Ta-Nehisi Coates said in a different context, very young and very smart is always a dangerous combination. And one of the problems with Silicon Valley, as the musician Zoe Keating has put it, is that tech people can't imagine that everything they make isn't totally awesome for everyone else, because they can't imagine scenarios outside their own reality. I said that the chief question the world imposes on you and that college ought to help you begin to work out is who you are. The heart of reflection is self-reflection. The essence of knowledge is self-knowledge. If you don't know yourself, if you haven't, as it were, become visible to yourself, you don't know the biases with which you know everything else, and you don't know the motives that move you to action. But self-knowledge and knowledge of others are two sides of the same coin. They happen together, they work together. I think literature in particular enables you to think about yourself by asking you to think about others. You should read. First of all, you should read. Let's just leave it at that. You should read not to affirm or entrench your identity, but to expand your humanity. By allowing you to experience in the most intimate and immediate way what it feels like to be somebody else, literature instills the fundamental moral lesson, which is you are not, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, the center of the universe. Other people are just as real as you, and also they aren't you. The novelist and philosopher Rebecca Goldstein says, I place my faith in fiction, in its power to make vividly present how different the world feels to each of us. Its power, in other words, to enable you to imagine scenarios outside your own reality. And that's a power you need to have before you can responsibly use any other kind of power. Before you can make things better or have an impact or change society. So by all means, take your moral passion forth into the world when you graduate. But in the meantime, your job is to think. Before you change the world, you have to change your mind. Thank you.
We're going to take a few minutes for questions for Dr. Deresiewicz. And I'm going to take the first one, but if you have a question, raise your hand. Is that right? Give a microphone?
We're just going to project. It's small enough.
Maybe stand.
Stand.
Who are you? That seems like a crucial question. And yeah, there was, referring to your book, there was a question that I wanted to ask, which comes from on page 168, the point where you say, talking about the value of reading and finding one of Kafka's axes, and it doesn't matter so much which one, that it wears on you. You say a real reader creates her own canon, for it consists precisely of those books that she has used to create herself. Can we create ourselves? And I guess that the point of the question is, if, as you said at the beginning, what we're after is the good. It's kind of despairing to think that we're going to create ourselves out of. Where do we get the stuff to make ourselves
Right. Well, we certainly don't create ourselves all by ourselves, starting from nothing. And as I said, by the time you're 18, usually the world has already created you. And to a certain extent, there are a lot of things that you can't do anything about at that point. But I think that one of the things that happens when you enter into young adulthood, and it often starts before you get to college, is that you become self-aware. You might also start to become aware of the things that have formed you. And you're able to take a step back from the things that have formed you and also from yourself and say, who am I at this point? What do I believe? Do I believe everything I've been told? And then, yeah, I mean, I actually think that college especially, and to the extent that it's possible for the rest of your life, should be a program of self-recreation through reading, reflection, experience, interacting with other people. You know, you're not completely plastic. You can't completely create yourself. But I think it's a real thing. I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, people do it, right? Probably you do it. To the extent that you can. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure why I think you said the word despairing, or you certainly seem skeptical.
Well, maybe the question put differently is thinking about the good. It's one thing to see that it's hard to discern the good.
Yeah.
No one fully has a grasp of it.
Yeah.
It seems to me what's characteristic of our era as well is a deep skepticism that there is anything there, that there is any good other than. But what we do know is that we know what we feel, we know what we want,
Yeah.
and it's that question of whether we're creating ourselves and making up our good.
Yeah.
That actually is part of the same problem that leads to what you described.
Right. Well, so you're saying that part of the problem, the reason society is so screwed up, is because there were now we're these modern individuals who think that we can self-invent, and that's where all the problem starts. And it was better when we sort of inherited our traditional notions of the good. That's a position. That's a kind of conservative, sort of Burkean position. And then there's the other position you referred to, kind of the postmodern position that we don't even have selves, and we're just an intersection of various social forces that have constructed us, and we don't speak so much as the discourse speaks through us. And I don't accept either of those things, and I mean, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I still believe in the good old modern self, which is a self that introspects, that has solitude, that is capable of resisting the world. It's not complete, it's not an Emersonian self that just makes itself up out of whole cloth, but this sort of idea that the discourse is just speaking through us, I don't believe that either. Okay?
Others.
Yeah. In the back, yeah. Please stand, thank you.
Hello, thank you. When you talk about Doxa and how students show up to college with certain presuppositions about comforting things their parents told them or other beliefs that they might come with, is the goal to necessarily help change their mind or to really have a deep understanding to question why they believe that and perhaps arrive to a conclusion that supports that presupposition?
Right, absolutely right. I mean, you could go through this process of deep reflection and reading and conversation and argument and debate and end up with the same positions you started with, but in a much more legitimate, well-understood way. I think it's unlikely, right? Usually when they do that, they end up with at least some different positions. I'm not also saying you're going to end up 180 degrees. But, right, the important thing is not to change it per se, but to think. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that helps. Yeah.
First, thank you for coming. This was awesome. My question is kind of about, it goes to a quote from David Benson, The Character, which is more or less like the biggest victories are the ones over ourselves, like internal victories versus like things we achieve in the world. And as we talk about like, service or impact or like things that our people in our generation want to do and helping other people, how do you balance, or how would you say to balance kind of searching for self-knowledge and wisdom with kind of the more externally oriented like achievements? Because you can spend your entire life contemplating and trying to understand yourself, but is it worth much if it's not necessarily applied to help those in suffering?
No, I absolutely agree. It's not either or. And it's interesting, David Brooks's book that you referred to, The Road to Character, I read a lot of the book. I'm not sure if he says this, but something about the nature of the word character seems to me to speak both to the internal, but also, I mean, character classically is known through action, it's formed through action. So I didn't say, like, just lock yourself in a room for the rest of your life. I'm saying you're already very oriented towards action, it seems, generationally. I'm saying there's another half that has to happen. And I also presented it sequentially, like think now and then act, but of course, it's both at the same time. And yeah. Yes?
Is there any particular discipline that they really makes you think, or is it kind of just like broadening the disciplines that you're used to personally learning about?
Is there any discipline? Well, like I said, I have this bias towards the humanities in terms of how it can enable self-reflection. But I certainly think that all of the liberal arts disciplines, if they're taught properly, are great trainings in thinking rigorously. And the truth is, if you've learned to think rigorously, even about a subject that sort of doesn't touch on existential questions of meaning, it should equip you to think rigorously about anything, right? Which is also why, the truth is, the real meaning of the phrase liberal arts, it's the kind of education that's appropriate for free people, which once meant like male property owners. But now, no, but we have this whole thing in the United States that we did over centuries, really, where we expanded our idea both of citizenship beyond white property, male property owners, and our idea of who should get an education, who should even get a college education. And those two things always came along together. So I don't know if anyone ever told you this, but central to the idea of American education, K through 12 as well as college, is that we're preparing people to be citizens. And what does it mean to be a citizen? It means to be able to participate responsibly in public debate and to take public action in a responsible way. So yeah, any of the disciplines, and all of them should help you do that. Yes?
You mentioned that college, the purpose of college used to be more how to think, and now it's kind of more how to achieve certain goals. What do you think is barring students today from kind of that more traditional how to think rather than pursuing this utilitarian?
Well, what do you think?
I think it's a lot of different things, but I think, there's a lot of apathy in this generation. Even though there is a lot of passion, I think underlying it is a lot of apathy, and I think that
Interesting.
tends to kind of stifle.
That's interesting. I'm not sure if you would agree with this, because I'm totally going to change the term you just used. You said apathy. But I mean, I think it's a lot of things. I think the best answer is everything I talked about in Excellent Sheep. What you call apathy, I would call careerism. Like, you are, especially if you ended up at Duke, you are trained to be a hoop jumper from the moment you can walk. And you never think more than a week in advance, the next test, the next internship, the next whatever. You might have all the moral passion in the world, which I think your generation certainly has a lot. But it's only ever just a hobby, because what you're really doing is pursuing that professional career path. And especially once you get out of college, I think it takes a very strong person, someone who's also willing to sacrifice a lot professionally, to keep with the whole change the world thing, because you have to do your job 100% of the time. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In the back, stand up, please.
I guess my question was pretty closely related to that. I guess in my experience, I think a lot of the instrumental nature of learning in college is a function of, I guess, the 21st century job market itself, which requires the instrumental kind of thinking. You know, it's not highly likely that you're going to be a first-year associate or whatever, and you're going to be sort of like questioning the nature of your like high-powered job, but also to recoup the amount of money that you shell out to go to the universities in the first place. So, especially if you're saddled with debt, I guess you kind of have to apply the instrumental learning just to like come out even. And I was wondering whether that might say is like more a function of external factors rather than within the university itself.
Yeah, listen, first of all, you're totally right. It's not either or, including in college, especially in college. The whole way American higher ed is set up, and this is pretty much unique in the world, is that you don't just study one thing, and you're encouraged to study and think about other things. So I think there's still room to do that. You're absolutely right. The job market requires it. The amount of student debt students take on. This is, to me, one of the great problems with the way that we've saddled students with student debt. That's a relatively new thing. The truth is that in the 60s, when college was free, or next to free, lots of people studied the humanities, including people who came from working class backgrounds, because they had the freedom to. I never, ever pretend that these are not difficult choices that you have to make. But I wouldn't, depending on your particular situation, everyone's situation is different, you should not feel that your choice is compelled in the way that maybe you've been told that it's compelled. You have more choice than you think you do. Yeah.
You gestured at the beginning, and I haven't read the book, so maybe it's implicit in the
Yeah.
book, but you gestured at the beginning that you're not sure you believe about this or what you said in the book today, so things have changed, perhaps, in your perceptions of what's going on. So either, so maybe two questions. One is, what's changed in the last 5 years when you think about 18-year-olds? Or, if that is not quite a long enough time frame, what do the next 5 or 10 look like? What's changing and where is this headed?
Yeah, I mean, because what I talk about in the book is that students seem to be, I talk about the calm acceptance of the status quo among elite college students. When I wrote the book, it still seemed this way to me, and certainly when I first started to think about this in 2008, the young people were as depoliticized as my generation had been, as they had been in the 90s. There was not a lot of political passion evident. Maybe people woke up for 1 second to vote for Obama and then they went back to sleep. So, I mean, since Occupy, since the financial collapse took a few years, and since, obviously, since the election of Trump, there's been a new political mobilization. How long it'll last, what the outcomes will be, nobody knows. That was the difference that I was talking about. But I'm simply saying that doesn't solve all the problems. Go ahead.
So I know you mentioned that your status quo was more so on the elite Ivy League and public private school institutions, but in terms of maybe community colleges, trade schools, where their sole focus is in training people for the job market and careers, are we sacrificing that idea of learning this kind of teaching this kind of thing? And if so, then how do we go about fixing that for the vast majority of students who are in those types of institutions?
That's a good question. You also reminded me of something I wanted to say. You can sit, you don't have to stand while I'm answering, unless you want to. To the guy all the way in the back, one more thing I wanted to say. We were talking about student debt and the job market and how that puts pressure on students. But that's also, it's changed in all kinds of really fundamental ways how colleges conduct themselves. Colleges have, to a great extent, recreated themselves as trade schools, or there was always a vocational component. So those components have been emphasized more and more and more and more to the detriment of real liberal learning. And I mean, this cuts across the entire sector. It's not just community colleges and state schools. It's very much, I mean, when a school, I don't know, maybe like Duke, tells you that you're going to be a leader, or has a career services department that tells you about all the wonderful opportunities you can have in consulting, or I don't know what's happening here, but maybe shrinks humanities departments and builds giant new glass palaces to the STEM fields, they are marketing themselves as vocational schools, very high-end vocational schools. So the nature of college itself has changed. This didn't happen overnight. Enormous amounts of money are involved, including money that taxpayers are refusing to pay to educate other people's children. So it's not going to change overnight either. But as I said before to someone over there, I think, we had this idea in this country that everyone was going to participate as a citizen, and we're going to have more people go to college, partly for vocational reasons. The economy was changing. We needed more educated people. We were going to build a mass middle class for the first time, which we did. I'm not sure about the level of community college, but I think certainly at the state university level, that was always part of it. And I deeply believe that true democracy, true equality, requires that we recognize that everybody who wants an education like that deserves an education like that and should have an education like that at the taxpayer's expense. Now, getting that done is a different problem than saying it. Yeah.
We're going to take two more questions, one in the back, and then take one in the front. No.
And then that's okay. Then afterwards, I'll hang around and we'll talk some more.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for coming here and conferences. So I think educational system and the problems with it is truly a universal problem. Because I grew up in China, and I think I grew up realizing that the way that I learn is very different from a lot of the mainstream educational system. But I always managed to find a way to get around them. So for example, I went to high school in China, and I decided it wasn't really quite there for me. I would like to consider about purpose of how things are related to each other before I applied them, where a lot of the practices within the mainstream education would teach you the skills and would encourage you to apply it without thinking too much about the purpose or the reason behind it. So then I dropped out of high school. I decided I want to go to an art school in Pennsylvania. So I did art for high school. And then I realized, college application, I don't agree with the system of how people should go through certain process of applying to school within a limited amount of time. So I took gap years. So I took 2 gap years before coming here, and I think my expectation as I just started at Duke is I'm really looking forward to how a rigorous, prestigious university that is well known in the world would bring to my life. I think one disappointment, or one thing that I really wouldn't expect, is that I kind of realized how restrained I am as a college student, where I was expecting to be more free compared to be in the real world by doing my gap year. It just somehow, with all those resources that the school provides to every student that they can utilize, they can do to create or to seek different options, there's also still that very pressuring dynamics within the school that people are expected to behave in a certain way, to meet certain standards, or to pursue certain career. So I think in that sense, I feel very unsupported. What are some of the practical suggestions you have for certain students if they feel like they're very different from the main crowd?
Yeah, to me, this is the huge irony, is that students who get here, even students from lower income backgrounds, certainly the majority of students who are from affluent backgrounds, they can do whatever they want. They have they're like the freest people in the history of the world. And yet, they seem to be the most constrained people in the history of the world because of the expectations that are placed on them. Just quickly, I was asked to speak at a liberal arts college in China. It's the only liberal arts college in China. It's this weird thing. It's basically paid for entirely by one billionaire, Hong Kong billionaire. And I thought, I don't know what they're literally not going to understand me. I mean, almost literally not going to understand me. Now, it's true the students who came were all proficient in English. So at least we had that in common. But I was amazed because their questions, adjusting for differences, they were the same questions. They were the same questions I get at every school I talk at in America. It was like, how can I have a meaningful education? So, to me, the great political hope is that moral passion is an ever-renewable resource, and the great educational hope is that young people, the desire, the hunger of young people for meaning is an ever-renewable resource that we can always tap into. What can you do when you find yourself in the system short of going to a different school? I mean, it sounds like you're the kind of person who already has the answer, because the answer is, don't care about what anybody else around you thinks. Don't worry if everyone else is getting internships their sophomore year so they can get better internships their junior year so they can get the... Who cares, right? Just shut out the noise. Use the resources that you have here to explore or build your own path or find your mentors. It's that strength, it's that inner strength that comes from building yourself and knowing who you are that can help you reject all the other expectations that people are putting on you.
Last question here.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, please.
Talking about community colleges and drivers, I want to speak up on behalf of the people of North Carolina
That's great.
And it's not, the dream is not dead in that sense, I feel like. At least at this stage, there's a strong commitment to the principle and get this education. Does that mean that it's not still somewhat utilitarian? Okay,
Sure.
that's a fact.
Listen, I mean, you guys have built one of the best state systems in the country. Although you're kind of a medium-sized state, it's one of the best state systems in the country, and that's absolutely to your credit. I live in Oregon now. The portion of the budget of the University of Oregon that comes from the taxpayer, it's 5%. And the school sucks. No offense. It's a terrible system.
We have a liberal arts college in China. I just want to make sure we said that before.
Is that right? Where is it? Oh wow. Kind of like Yale in Singapore. There's like a now Duke kind of new liberal arts. No, but it's sort of the same idea of partnership.
A lot better.
Wow. You know what this? I know we got to go, but you know what this tells you? Yale in Singapore, Duke in China. The rest of the world has figured out that what makes the American economy dynamic is the liberal arts. But we're like shedding the liberal arts as fast as we can because we want to be more like China and Singapore. Let's have our kids do more tests. That's what we need.
So on that hopeful note, please join me in thanking our speakers.